On August 15, 1947, after more than 3 centuries under British rule, the Indian subcontinent finally gained its independence. But freedom came with a price: partition. The land was divided into two separate nations, India and Pakistan. Pakistan itself was split into two regions, West Pakistan and East Pakistan, which later became Bangladesh. The reason for this division was mainly religious. Pakistan was meant to be a homeland for Muslims, while India was to remain a majority Hindu country. Indian nationalists had been pushing for independence for a long time, but when it actually happened, the decision to divide the country came very suddenly. After World War II, Britain realized it could no longer afford to govern India and wanted to leave as soon as possible. Tensions were rising fast, especially after deadly riots broke out in August 1946. To avoid the risk of a full-blown civil war, the British decided to speed things up. They originally set July 1948 as the date for Indian independence, but that timeline didn't last long. In June 1947, Lord Louis Mountbatten, the British viceroy at the time, announced that India would become independent by August, just 2 months later, and that the land would be split into two nations, one Hindu majority and one Muslim majority. However, he didn't say exactly where the borders would be. That task was handed to a British lawyer named Cyril Radcliffe. He had never been to India before, and he didn't know much about the geography or the deep religious mix of regions like Bengal and Punjab. These areas had nearly equal numbers of Hindus and Muslims, making the job even harder. Still, Radcliffe was given just 5 weeks to draw the lines that would divide the country and impact millions of lives. Looking back, he was clearly the wrong person for such a massive responsibility. In a 1971 interview, Radcliffe admitted he had nearly handed over Lahore to India by mistake. He also said the time he had been given was far too short, suggesting that it should have taken at least 2 or 3 years to do the job properly. On August 17, 1947, 2 days after India and Pakistan declared independence, the new borders were made public. Radcliffe had split the subcontinent into 3 areas: India, West Pakistan, and East Pakistan. Even regions like Punjab and Bengal, which had long shared culture and history, were cut in 2. The British Army left soon after, abandoning the 2 new nations in a state of chaos. What followed was one of the largest and most violent migrations in modern history, as millions of people were forced to leave their homes and move across the new borders. Just 2 weeks after the new borders of India and Pakistan were drawn, the horrors of partition were already making headlines. On September 2, 1947, The Sphere published a chilling article titled "The Sikh-Muslim Orgies of Violence in the Punjab." It showed photographs of destruction and death across East Punjab, particularly in cities like Amritsar, Lahore, and Rawalpindi. The report described scenes of chaos where Sikhs, Hindus, and Muslims were all involved in acts of pillaging, killing, looting, and arson. The violence wasn't one-sided. According to the article, this wasn't just a conflict between 2 groups. It was all-out communal warfare. One journalist even recalled seeing 50 villages burning from the air. By the time the article was printed, 10,000 people had already been murdered in Punjab. It also noted that of the 300,000 Hindus who had lived in Lahore before partition, at least 10,000 had already fled to India. Now, more than 7 decades later, we know the full scale of what happened. Around 14 million people were uprooted, and over 1 million were killed. A week later, on September 13th, The Sphere followed up with another grim piece titled "The Twoway Exodus in the Punjab." It described how Muslims were fleeing westward to Pakistan, while Sikhs and Hindus rushed eastward to India. The violence didn't stop. People who couldn't make it out were often slaughtered. An aerial photograph showed the city of Jalandhar in flames. Other images captured terrified families, Sikhs, Hindus, and Muslims alike, grabbing what little they could and escaping in cars and overloaded trains. The article noted that only 10,000 Hindus remained in Lahore. Nearly 290,000 had already crossed into India. It estimated that 200,000 people had died in the violence tearing through both West and East Punjab. But the tragedy didn't end with numbers. The article also drew attention to the brutal toll on women and children. Partition unleashed a wave of gendered violence that was especially devastating. Nearly 100,000 women were kidnapped and raped during this time. Muslim women in Punjab suffered the most. According to historian Kamal Basin, about 50,000 women were abducted while trying to reach Pakistan, and another 33,000 were taken while heading to India. Partition wasn't just about lines on a map. It was a human catastrophe that left deep scars, especially on the most vulnerable. In South Asian societies, a family's izzat, the Hindi and Urdu word for honor, is deeply tied to its identity. And more often than not, it's the women in the family who are expected to uphold that honor. This idea runs through generations, both in the subcontinent and across the diaspora. A woman's actions, her choices, even her body, are often seen as reflecting on her family's reputation. Above all, it's her chastity that's most closely linked to izzat. So, during and after the partition of 1947, when mass violence broke out and thousands of women were raped or abducted, many families chose a horrific path to protect their honor. Honor killings or pressuring the women into suicide, all in the name of preserving virginity. In their book, Borders and Boundaries, Women in India's Partition, Kamla Basin and Ritu Menon describe one such tragic event. In Toa Khalsa, a Sikh village in what is now Pakistan, 90 women threw themselves into a well to drown. The men in the village, outnumbered by Muslim mobs, believed there was no other way to save the women's honor. In another town, Sheikhupura, a doctor reportedly shot 50 to 60 women, his own relatives, to prevent them from being captured. In Quetta, a patriarch took a sword and beheaded 13 members of his own family, including his daughters. When interviewed years later, one of their male relatives didn't say they were murdered. He said they had been martyred. These are just a few of the many stories that show how deeply the idea of honor affected real lives during partition. The damage caused by the rushed decisions of the British government and Cyril Radcliffe on August 17, 1947, was massive and long-lasting. Joya Chatterjee, a professor of South Asian history at Cambridge, has described the partition as more than just a historical event. She compares it to a surgical cut, an amputation. The borders Radcliffe drew have left scars that are still painfully visible even 76 years later. The immediate violence may have faded within months, but the emotional wounds, the personal losses, and the trauma still run deep in many South Asian families. For millions, the Radcliffe Line wasn't just a line on a map. It meant being torn away from ancestral homes, from land where their families had lived for generations. Communities were split overnight. People who once lived side by side turned into enemies. Entire families were separated. The violence that erupted led to the deaths of over 1 million people and the rape of countless women. In regions like Bengal and Punjab, where Hindus, Muslims, and Sikhs had shared history and culture for centuries, the divide cut through the very fabric of society. And that divide, born of a decision made in haste, has left behind a legacy of pain and mistrust that continues to shape the region even today.